Hi everyone, welcome back to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 16th, where we are talking about Blair Witch Project. And I am happy to report that at least as of this moment, I've been able to find a link for Blair Witch Project. As you know, it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to find links for the movies as we get into more contemporary movies. But I was able to find a link, and certainly if it turns out that you have a better link, please share that with me. At this point, we had finished up with Halloween, and I think you can see how much John Carpenter, the director of Halloween, was influenced by Psycho. Not just in terms of character names and casting, because Jamie Lee Curtis would be the daughter of Vivien Leigh, who ended up being Marion Crane in Psycho. But just this idea of watching, and Carpenter puts us in the position of that as a voyeur through the use of our seeing through the eyes of the murderer that bonds us with the murderer. It's an old technique that has roots all the way back to John Milton's Paradise Lost, the great epic poem, where we see the fall of mankind in paradise, and it's Satan's story, really, that we are given, where Satan is presented more as a sympathetic character. I can't say that Michael Myers is presented as a sympathetic character, but it's hard not to see this movie from a symbolic perspective, even though John Carpenter says that wasn't his intention. But as you know, oftentimes subconscious intentions find their way into film. And the idea that we have a force of vengeance that is basically punishing youth who are engaged in behaviors that society would not deem acceptable is hard to ignore. And certainly the idea that Jamie Lee Curtis in her character of Laurie Strode survives, the virginal character survives, which has come to be known as the final girl. It's become such a trope at this point that in these slasher films, basically Carpenter created the slasher genre in the way that we think of it. That the final girl, after much humiliation and much pain, ultimately survives because she is the one who, quote, deserves, unquote, to survive, as opposed to the other characters, these wayward teens who usually are engaged in sexual promiscuity and drug use. And that said, when we think about the 1980s, and I'm well aware that Carpenter did his film in the late 1970s, but we usually think of the 80s in regards to this conservative agenda that was put forth by Ronald Reagan about punishing vice and returning to a standard of, quote, normality, unquote, whatever normality happens to be. I think it's hard not to see the slasher genre in that respect. That's why I use the 1980s as I use Halloween as our representation for the 1980s, even though it came out slightly before that, just because it influenced so many films in the 1980s that followed that particular formula. And of course, what we've got now is a connection with serial killer, something that we began to see with Psycho. Again, we can see how Carpenter was influenced by Psycho, and that evil never dies. There is that supernatural element to the film, which I appreciate, setting it in Halloween, which is so important from a pagan and a supernatural perspective. The idea that this is when the veil is thinnest between the living and the dead, and if it is indeed the case that Michael Myers cannot be killed, then it would be a perfect time for his kind of monstrosity to exist. And we also get to see what's behind the mask, not just Michael Myers' mask, but more importantly, what's the mask behind the mask of suburbia, that it's hardly a safe place. Understand that Michael Myers, as a small child, was basically born and raised there before he killed his sister. And it seems telling that he kills his sister, who's supposed to be babysitting him, and instead she's neglecting her duties and spending time with her boyfriend. And the fact that the parents aren't home, and in so much of this movie the parents are absent, also seems to be a commentary on what happens when you have a disintegration of a two-parent household where there isn't an authority figure in place to watch over teenagers. Well, then a lot of negative consequences could occur. So that said, I wanted to move forward to the Blair Witch Project, which I think is very illustrative of the 1990s. The Blair Witch Project is important in terms of starting the found footage movement and the way that we think of it today. It's very meta. It's a movie about making a movie. And they used method acting, and it's one of the reasons why I think the film has a sense of realism to it. The actors were actually abandoned in the wilderness, and they were subjected to things like limited food and water so that they could appear to be as stricken as the actual characters in the film themselves. Supposedly, the directors would come in the middle of the night, as the actors actually had to sleep in tents at night in the wilderness, and try to frighten the actors with noises outside. So, very similar to slasher films in the sense that you isolate your characters and you eliminate them one by one with this dehumanizing force. The thing with the Blair Witch Project is that we're never given a definitive sense of what that dehumanizing force happens to be. It's very deliberately ambiguous. We had talked about how that oftentimes works better in horror film, to suggest rather than to show. The shaky camera technique, which I find difficult to watch because I suffer from a little bit of motion sickness, was meant to not only give a sense of realism to the film, but to cause audience discomfort so that it would mimic some of the discomfort the actual characters would be feeling as well. And talking about independent films on shoestring budgets, this film was done for $60,000, basically on cash advances of credit cards. It earned over $250 million. To give you an idea of the kind of profitability that horror film can generate. I like to think of this not just as a commentary on documentary, because it is a mockumentary. And by the way, the marketing was genius for this. They had put up a website that was blairwitch.com that offered newsreel footage and interviews of the supposedly 3 young student filmmakers who are shooting a film about an urban legend. And then they came out with a mockumentary again on the Sci-Fi Channel called The Curse of the Blair Witch, where they created this entire mythology about the Blair Witch. Even on the Internet Movie Database, it listed the actors as deceased. And what all of this did, and keep in mind it was the fairly early days of the internet, was to convince many audiences that when they went to see the Blair Witch Project, they were actually watching real footage and not a mockumentary. So it was genius marketing. It also begs the question, as I think all of our electronic communications do now, what exactly is reality? And in that way, I think the film was very much ahead of its time. It was done in the 1990s, so this would still be the early days of the internet. They couldn't have in any way, I think, guessed where we would be with the internet now, with social media and artificial reality and all of the rest. But the question of what is real and how do you document that, and can you trust documentation, and is documentation more valid over personal experience, I think are the exact issues that we're grappling with now in the 2020s. When I think about how easy it might be to dismiss an audience from the 1990s believing that what they were watching was real footage, it really wasn't that long ago, less than a decade ago or so, when the Discovery Channel had put on another mockumentary about the Megalodon, which is supposed to be about a prehistoric shark. And it was done so realistically so that if you miss the beginning that indicated that it was fictionalized, you would think, and many audience members did, that what they were watching was a real documentary, much to the anger and chagrin of audiences the day after, with a lot of accusations against the Discovery Channel that they had expected better, something much more realistic from the Discovery Channel because of its reputation. That also goes to show how the media has changed, because I think now we're skeptical of just about all forms of media. But back then, there was still an assumption that there was a level of integrity, at least to some media. But when you watch the Blair Witch Project, and again, I warn you, if you happen to suffer from motion sickness, that the camera can be rather shaky. What I oftentimes do is that I look away during those moments. What we will see are some issues about sanity and insanity, very common horror film theme, about the negatives and the consequences of technology, which I wanted to talk a little bit more about next class in the event that you haven't yet seen the film. Wilderness versus civilization, which is a common theme in literature as well, that wilderness is wild, untamed, as opposed to civilization, the world of natural order. This is a theme that goes all the way back to Shakespeare and even before. So that said, I'm hopeful that you're also looking or thinking about final projects as we get close to the ending of the semester. Do note that next Thursday we do not have class because that is Thanksgiving. And then after that, we have just 2 films left. The first being 28 Days Later to represent the 2000s, and the last being Get Out to represent the 2010s, as I'm still on the lookout for the 2020s as we approach the mid portion of this decade. Hard to believe how that happened. But in the event that you are planning on writing a traditional paper for your final project, and I encourage all of you at this point to reach out to me about some of your thinking about the final project. You'll notice that in the notes below in the 3rd section, I've given you some review about how to go about quoting. And this is using the MLA system, or the Modern Language Association system, which is a system that we use in the humanities. And that includes things like English classes and communication classes, which is our class. And if you'll remember, English 101 is a prerequisite for this course. So I'm hopeful that this is just quick review. But usually what you do with the MLA system is you try to be as simple as possible. And that means using quotation marks when you're using an exact quotation. And then immediately after that quote, in parentheses, you would indicate a page number. And you don't have to write P or PG or anything like that. And then you close your parentheses. You either continue on with your sentence, or if you're done with your sentence, you put some end punctuation. You can see that I've given you some examples below. If you are quoting from an actual film, instead of page number, what you do is you put a timestamp in the parentheses. And if it turns out that you wanted to insert something into a quote, let's say you wanted to insert in your own language, and this is between when you start the quote and end the quote, because you can start the quote at any point, even mid-sentence. And you can end the quote at any point, even mid-sentence. But before that start and end point, if you were to, let's say, insert something into a quote because you wanted to clarify, usually it's to clarify the meaning of a pronoun, like she or he, where it might be unclear which person you're referencing based on the quotation that you've chosen. You use square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets, and you put in your insertion. So you can see that I've given you an example of that in the 3rd section. Quote, even his, and then immediately after his, I wrote the character's name. Krebs's, and notice that's in square brackets. Lies were not sensational, unquote, and then parentheses 162 to indicate that would be on page 162, close parentheses, and punctuation. So anything within the square brackets is not part of the original quotation. You are adding it in, again, to clarify, not to comment on the quote, because you can always comment on the relevance of a quote either beforehand or afterwards. You can also omit something from a quote, and this would be, again, between the start and the end point. You don't need to start with showing that you have an omission, because ultimately you get to start wherever you want. And you don't need to end showing you have an omission, because of course information is going to come after where you've decided to end your quote. But between that start point and that end point, if you were to use what we call an ellipsis, which means 3 periods in a row, or 3 dots, sometimes fondly known as, that indicates that you've left out a word or several words. Not to change the meaning, that would be unethical, but basically something that just isn't necessary. And you can see that in the example below in the third section under omission, where Krebs, and then quotation marks, during this time, and then the ellipsis, ... was sleeping late in bed, unquote. And then we've got our parentheses and then the page number within the parentheses, and then there would be the ending quotation. Or we would continue on with the sentence if necessary. So this indicates that between the word time and was, where we've got the ellipsis, either a word or several words have been left out from the original. The idea is just to provide a reader with enough information so that they could find the original quote, so they could verify its authenticity. And the system builds upon itself with layers. So this works very nicely if it's very clear what book or what movie you are quoting from, which you would probably indicate in your opening paragraph. However, if you are working with multiple books or multiple movies, it may not be clear which quote or what movie or book your quote is referencing. So if that happens to be the case, within the parentheses, you might need to include something like author's last name or the director's last name of the movie, and then either the page number or the timestamp. And if you've got multiple books or multiple movies by the same person, then last name isn't enough in the parentheses. You would have to add part of the name of the title. So you can see it just builds upon itself layer after layer. And the way all of this comes together is with a works cited page, which is a page at the very ending of the paper that literally lists all the works that you have cited or quoted from in your paper. They're all listed by author last name in alphabetical order, so they're easy to find. And there are differences with listing a book as opposed to a magazine article, as opposed to a film, as opposed to a website. And most people don't bother to memorize these differences. What they do is they look it up. The MLA, or Modern Language Association System, comes out with a handbook every year talking a little bit about the rules that you should follow. There are other systems as well, but you don't want to use the wrong system for the wrong discipline. So for instance, one system that you might have heard of is APA, American Psychological Association. But we use that for the sciences, not for the humanities. So I'm focusing on the MLA, which is what we would be doing. And you would just look up in their handbook their advice for how to cite something, and they basically update their handbook yearly because there are always changes to things like, well, how do you cite something from, and let's say there's a new technology. Obviously we don't know how to deal with that at this point, but representatives from the humanities would get together and make up a rule, and then that would be part of the MLA, and then you would look that up and do that accordingly. So in terms of the MLA, my suspicion is that you probably talked about it in your English 101 class. You may even have some information about it, perhaps an old handbook. But I wanted to recommend 2 websites to you that are very, very useful. One is called Purdue OWL. And again, you can see this in the third section below. And if you have heard of this before, you know that it is a website that was created by Purdue University. And it goes through all of the rules for writing. And it talks about the entire writing process. From the very beginning, which is generating ideas, to the very end, submitting in the final manuscript, and everything in between. So you could look up information about the MLA, or also just look up information about, let's say, comma usage or punctuation if you so wanted to. And even though it's affiliated with Purdue University, they've made it available to the public. So you don't need to be a member of Purdue in order to access it. So it's a great site. And another great site, which is not available to the public, but is available to you, is the GCC library site. Specifically, you will see that in some of the links, one is devoted just to writing and citation, and I've included that link below in the notes, because the GCC library is well aware that you are going to be basically writing research papers, and also critical papers, which is probably what this is. A research paper means you're not using outside resources. You can just analyze on your own. I'm not necessarily averse to a critical paper, but it's a different kind of exercise. I'd prefer that you not rely on too many outside sources. That said, we've been talking about these texts, or I should say films, though we've been treating these films as texts, with, yes, some information from the textbook, but we haven't been using a lot of outside sources. It's been mostly our own interpretation. And that said, I know that I've fallen a bit behind with the discussion forum responses. My intent is to catch up in the next couple of weeks. I'm sorry about that. But I should be caught up with enough time for you to be able to utilize all of that information in your final project, if you so elected to do so. Keep in mind that I've indicated that you don't need to respond to your classmates unless you want to, much like a face-to-face class and a class discussion. But you are required to read all of your classmates' responses, and ultimately my responses in turn, which I will be catching up with. And that would give you a good idea of what we would have talked about during class discussion, something perhaps that you could utilize for the final project or for the final examination, which I'll be talking a little bit more about as we get a little bit closer to that. But basically, the final exam is an essay exam. And what I'm going to do is just give you a series of prompts or questions and ask you to choose within them. And it is an open book, open note exam. So it's not a question of memorization. It's a question of understanding about the connections of everything that we've talked about this semester. If this was a face-to-face class, you'd have approximately 2-ish hours to do the final exam. This isn't a face-to-face class, obviously, so you will have 24 hours after I post it online. And again, it's open book, open notes, and I'll just ask you to send it to me the same way that you've been sending me your journals, via PDF to my email. And basically, the exam is a way for you to sort of think about how horror film is important in media and popular culture, and how horror film reflects some of the anxieties of our times, which is what we've been talking about all semester long, and is what your attendance question will be for the Blair Witch Project. And this will be due on our discussion forum on the 18th of November. Again, if you need additional time, just ask me. I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And your question will be specifically about the Blair Witch Project. Now that we're getting into more contemporary times, though I'm well aware that some of you might not have been born in the 1990s, but the 1990s is still close enough, I think, for us to have some sort of sense of the history of the time. How do you think the Blair Witch Project represents the 1990s in America? How do you think the Blair Witch Project represents the 1990s in America? So I'll leave you to watching the Blair Witch Project. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Next week, just so that you don't forget, I will post on our Moodle site that it's Thanksgiving and that we will not be meeting, but the week after that, we will be talking about 28 days later. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and have a good Thanksgiving. Take care. Bye-bye.